All right, hello everyone. My name is Philip Vaughter, and I am a researcher at the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Studies of Sustainability in Tokyo, Japan. And I will be presenting a paper today on an overview of education on climate action, looking at trends and next steps within the field. This is part of a panel discussion that some of us will be having at CIES on April 27th. But if you're unable to attend the panel discussion, please check out this video and please email me if you have any questions. So very briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about background of research in climate education, briefly touch on the methodology used in this study, then move on to key findings before I go to the conclusion. So a little bit of background on research in climate change education. One of the big issues, like in a lot of issues within education for sustainable development, is that responsibility for who creates what is often left unclear. A typical situation that we see, as evidenced by Martin et al. In their 2013 paper, is you have different government ministries tasked with creating the curriculum for teaching about climate change, and then a different ministry for implementing. So oftentimes we see a Ministry of Environment create the curriculum, but then we have teachers that are supposed to teach it. And oftentimes this leads to a disconnect between the modalities that work best for students, and it also leaves a lot of people outside of the formal school system out of the dialogue. In addition, education on climate change tends to really stress knowledge, not action, on mitigating or adapting to climate change. This has been a focal point of the research for over a dozen years now, going back to Negev and her colleagues in 2008. And we see that students and young people have a very good grasp of the science and the implications for climate change. What they're not being taught is any meaningful actions they can take to mitigate or to adapt to it. And then also, when we do have actions that are stressed in curriculum, they tend to be very low impact actions. So there was a very famous paper by Wins and Nichols that circulated the social media circles in 2017. So you might be familiar with this graphic. And what these two researchers did was they looked at what type of actions were being taught to secondary students in a lot of high-income developed countries. So looking at secondary curriculum texts from North America, Europe, and Australia. And what they found was that often lower impact actions, such as changing a light bulb or planting a single tree, were emphasized at the risk of talking about more high impact or even moderate impact actions to mitigate climate change. So here at UNU, we don't just work with formal education. We work with networks that work with formal and non-formal education in the form of regional centers of education for regional centers of expertise on education for sustainable development. And these local networks, usually at the city or community level, do include school systems and universities, but they also link with non-formal education actors such as science museums, local governments, and local businesses and NGOs to create an integrated agenda for sustainable development in the region. And during the Global Action Program on Education for Sustainable Development from 2015 to 2019, climate change or climate action was one of the most prevalent topics throughout RCE projects. So approximately 30% of all projects reported during this time period had a focus on climate action. So very briefly, the methods and objectives for this particular study. The objectives were to characterize and evaluate RCE projects on climate action during the gap. So what are some of their defining features? And also to characterize the impacts of climate actions being taught among RCEs, to look at Wins and Nichols methods and replicate those in looking at ESD projects that combine formal and non-formal schooling. So all data was collected from the RCE Project Report Archive, which is available on our RCE portal. And we did some quantitative analysis as well as some content analysis, again, replicating the methodology of Wins and Nicholas. And so in total, we had 137 RCE projects from 62 different RCEs across 30 countries around the globe. And when we look at the primary audiences that RCEs engaged with, we really do see a variety. So we do see primary, secondary, and higher education being a focus, but really what defines RCEs is we also see a lot of projects that focus on this community education or this non-formal or informal youth education. And oftentimes cases or individual projects would combine two elements. So you'd have a secondary school curriculum that teaches its students climate action, and then in turn students go and do a public awareness campaign within the community. So we see a lot of this linking the formal and the non-formal in the different audiences that RCE projects were working with. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals that were targeted within RCE projects on climate action, obviously we see a lot of focus for every project on both Goal 4, which is quality education, and Goal 13, which is climate action. But we also see a fairly prevalent focus on Goal 15, life on land, particularly conserving forests, wetlands, and grasslands in order to mitigate climate change. A big focus on responsible consumption and production too, so looking at the power consumers have and educating people on that in their consumption patterns, as well as the links to good health and well-being and how the topic intersects with action and mitigation in regards to climate change. In terms of other thematic areas, a lot of these projects worked with a curriculum development component. So rather than adapting an existing program, a lot of these projects had to start from scratch because there wasn't space or there wasn't an approach to climate change within their local education systems. Some other themes that were really prevalent included traditional knowledge, working with Indigenous communities, as well as a lot of focus on landscapes for forests and trees, individual plant and animal species, and waste reduction. So within the Global Action Program that I mentioned earlier, we had 5 different areas of priority actions. And for RCE projects on climate action, a lot of them focused on priority action area 5, which was that community engagement. But we also saw pretty prevalent trends in engaging with capacity building for educators, capacity building for youth, and engaging with modifying learning and training environments. The one area that was a little bit underutilized in terms of engagement was engaging with the policy process in drafting climate change education policy. And this is fairly consistent for a lot of areas of ESD. So practitioners are pretty enthusiastic about the other 4, but when it comes to engaging in policy, there are a lot of barriers that were in place. All right, so moving on from some characteristics of the trends to looking at the impacts. The interesting thing about this was that when we look at the types of actions that are being taught, the RCE projects on climate action actually had a much higher frequency of moderate to high impact actions than in high school textbooks as reviewed by Wins and Nichols. So this was a really interesting insight because we see that there's a little more creativity in the approach to scaling up ambition in terms of what actions can be taught outside of formal education. And looking at some of the individual actions being taught, we see that yes, there is a great amount of low impact actions, but as I said, also a number of moderate actions and adaptation actions, which was something that hasn't been looked at previously. So not only are RCEs working on mitigating climate change, but actually we had some of them that were working with adapting to the effects of climate change, specifically for workforces that had to look at things like urban design and agricultural practices and retrain in response to a changing climate. For high impact actions, we also had quite a lot of innovative approaches, especially looking at conserving biodiversity, as mentioned previously. Interestingly, though, a lot of these high impact actions tended to emerge from RCEs within developing countries and not developed countries. Developed countries really tended to emphasize more moderate to low impact climate actions, which has some interesting implications. So very briefly, for the conclusion, the majority of climate change projects from the RCEs during the last 5 years of the GAP looked at formal and non-formal education, how the two could complement each other and reach a wider audience. Virtually all of the projects on climate action stressed action competence, so these weren't just knowledge lessons, they were actually engaging with teaching specific actions for mitigation or adaptation. And of these actions, a greater frequency had moderate to high impact actions stressed, as opposed to curriculum from secondary school text as reported in the Wins and Nicholas article. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, my email is in the slide.